Tonight we're talking about the issue of defining whether the issues that you're having at work or at home are normal issues that other people have, that's just a matter of processing, communicating, going deeply, or whether the issue is that you're really the problem. So the question I have at the bottom of the screen is what I'm feeling real, or am I the problem? And I think that probably everyone in this group at times, having been gaslighted, having been bullied, having been raised often in a traumatic childhood environment, not everyone, some people on this call tonight had really wonderful childhoods and had a really rude awakening when they entered medical school and discovered that, bullying, gaslighting, treating each other with disrespect was common, and they weren't used to that. For those who had already had a trauma history at home, it was like a double whammy, that not only do I have this past history that's mine that I contend with, but now it's reinforced and I'm re-traumatized by bullies at work, or by violent communication, or violent ways of being in the workplace. So one of the ways that we identify whether we're the problem or not initially is through external feedback. When we're little kids at home and we say something and everybody throws their heads back and laughs, ha, 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 we sort of look around and it's like, I must be funny. Or if we say something and we have company over and it's something that's rude, like, why is Mrs. So-and-so so fat? Or that, I don't like that dish that they brought. It tastes yucky. And then everybody looks at you and says, oh, be nice. What's your problem? That's impolite. And then we feel embarrassed. We start to feel self-conscious. And so the very, very beginnings, from the time we're toddling around, we learn to gauge our behaviors and compare it to what the expectations are of our immediate circle, which is our family, and then wider and wider at school, in our social setting, at church, in our community. And we start to understand the mores and the expectations of the community we find ourselves in. So I have a list here of some of the external feedback that we get that begins to undermine our sense of self and create some insecurity and questioning about whether our reality is true or whether we really are an issue. So one of the things many of us here have heard over and over again is that we're too much. And that usually comes with people who are highly intelligent, intense, highly focused. And so rather than people validating our intellect or our intensity, we get the message loud and clear that we're too much. We hear that we're overly sensitive. It's not really an issue. The fact that you're crying, or that you're angry, or that you're expressing what you feel is just evidence that you're too sensitive. You overthink things. Why do we have to talk about everything, overtalk everything? Just shut up and listen. You're illogical. That doesn't make any sense. You're dramatic. You exaggerate. We see that a lot with people who hurt themselves, like it's no big deal. We're not supposed to go, when we cut ourselves. If we are feeling sad, angry, afraid, then we're being dramatic. If we're expressing emotions, sometimes we're identified as negative. That's a really good way to shut somebody down. Don't be so negative. You're really pretty negative. And then we feel embarrassed and ashamed, and we want to be positive and fit in. You try too hard. You don't try hard enough. You just need to effort a little bit more. You're not passing step 2 is because you didn't try hard enough. You didn't study right. You're disorganized. When there's chaos at work, things are crazy, and we are targeted by being told we're disorganized, we're scattered, you need to work harder. So notice, there are many of these messages that we get that put us in double binds. You try too hard, you need to work harder. How many times have we had both of those messages come from the same person? You, in your attempts to be perfect and not make a mistake, really tried very, very hard. And then when you're exhausted, when you're at the end of your rope, when you're expressing the fact that your work-life balance is non-existent, then we hear about how we just need to be more efficient, we need to work harder, we need to loosen up, we worry too much. So these are some of the external feedback messages that we get on a day-to-day basis that start to erode our self-confidence. If you get even 2 of these messages on any given day, you begin to try to modify your behavior so that you are not perceived as being someone who's too much, too sensitive, illogical, dramatic, negative, uptight, not working hard enough. And often what happens is, rather than getting positive validation for our attempts to change ourselves so that we're not too much or too disorganized, we modify ourselves and we still don't get validation, or they just find something else on the list to criticize us for. And then we start to say, is this me? Is this me? Or is this, something else that's going on? The next thing that we rely on, usually it's external first, and then, as children moving up through the world, we internalize what those external messages have been. And so now we have not only what we're hearing externally, but what our inner narrative is. So we say, I make people uncomfortable. That is as a result of the you're too much. It's just me. I need to let go. I don't make sense. That's in response to the illogical external feedback. I'm overly dramatic. Don't pay attention to me. It's no big deal. So we start dismissing and minimizing. I guess I'm negative. I'm just a glass half empty person. Guess I'm controlling rather than I'm trying really hard or working really hard. I guess I need to try harder. I'm just disorganized. I'm stupid. I'm too self-focused. I need to relax. I'm dumb for being afraid. So these are some of the shifts in our internal landscape that happen as a result of that external feedback. And now we have not only the external feedback from family members, friends, coworkers that we're dealing with, we have this voice in our head that won't shut up, that's saying to you, if you weren't so negative, the nurses would like you. If you were less controlling, then you wouldn't be looking for another job. If you were more organized, you wouldn't have to work that 14-hour shift. And, so we start to believe that we are less than, that we are somehow lacking. And that is not necessarily true at all. So I want to talk about how can we determine whether it's us, whether we really have some issues and deficiencies we need to work on, or whether this is really a manifestation of a toxic or dysfunctional family system, a toxic or dysfunctional work system, unrealistic expectations that we have for ourselves and that we project out into the world, and therefore others expect the sun, moon, and stars from us. So the first thing we need to do is find the truth. And one of the ways to find the truth is to use a scientific approach. So in the scientific, we're going to talk about the scientific methodology on the next screen, but on the finding the truth slide, what I want you to do is start asking yourself, what is true? You know, what is really true about this situation? And you usually know that you're close to the truth when your shoulders relax a little bit, when you notice that your breathing drops into your belly rather than that shallow chest breathing, and you start to feel more yourself. And so how you can know the truth is by noticing what you're feeling in your body. If you're feeling extremely tense, restless, having a hard time focusing, then you may not be landing on the truth in the situation. You may instead be buying into what other people are projecting onto you. So if you can begin to identify some of the truths, well, I think that I'm uncomfortable at work. Let's start with something like that. You're having, that's putting it mildly. You're done with work. But if we're using sort of this truth-finding method and you're saying, okay, what is true about my work situation? Okay, the number one thing is I'm uncomfortable at work. And so then you say, how does that feel in my head? It feels like, duh. How does it feel in my chest? My chest is relaxed. How do my shoulders feel? How do my hips and how do I feel sitting in the chair? What's happening with my feet? Am I scrunching my toes or my feet relaxed? And so go to your body first and ask yourself, what is true? I'm uncomfortable at work. And then the next question is, how do I know I'm uncomfortable at work? Well, because I get migraines on every shift, because I can't wait for it to be over and I'm clock watching. Okay, so I'm uncomfortable at work. I know that's true. And the way I know that's true is by my behaviors when I'm at work. What is more true? And so what is more true? This isn't the right work situation for me. I'm not only uncomfortable, I'm, crawling out of my skin. I feel like, I'm dreading work every day. I sometimes feel like, work is making me sick. So we've deepened the conversation within ourselves. We've gone from what is true, which is I'm uncomfortable at work. We've scanned our bodies to make sure that that's true. And then in asking what is more true, we've identified that not only are we uncomfortable at work, we are in dire straits. And in fact, we're at risk of getting sick, and we need something to shift. How can I be sure? Because I've had more PTO days than I've ever had in my entire life, because my yearly evaluation was the poorest I've ever had. So to find some tangible evidence to support what is more true. The first, what is true, you're looking in your body. The second, what is more true, you're looking for external, tangible evidence to support what you believe to be true. What is false? What is false is that I love this job and that it's part of my mission in life in order to serve others and make a living. No, what's true is I'm uncomfortable at work. I'm on the verge of getting sick. What is false is that this is the right job for me. And then say all of these things out loud. So I gave you just a really brief outline of how to do this. If you want to talk to me and go deeper in that conversation, certainly email me, text me, and I'm happy to work with specific issues with you to really find out what's true, what's more true, what's false, and then say it out loud. Another example would be, what is true? I hate my work. What is more true? I'm ready to look for something else. What is false? Beggars can't be choosers. You know, some little cliche that we use to keep us in the golden handcuffs that require us to work in unsustainable situations. And so then once you say out loud what is true and you call out that which is false, you know, no, beggars can't be choosers is not a theme or a phrase that I am using as supporting a belief system. Instead, I'm ready for a change, and say it out loud. So the scientific method involves identifying the problem, forming a hypothesis. So identifying the problem, I'm unhappy at work. The hypotheses might be why you think you're unhappy at work. You test the hypotheses. So for instance, I'm unhappy at work. What's the hypotheses? I'm being targeted by the imaging department. Okay, so I'm going to test that hypothesis, and the next time I'm working in the emergency room on my shift, I am going to keep track of the patients that I send to the imaging center and whether I am respected when I mark something stat, whether they are, you know, doing a half-assed job, or whether they're really following through, calling me if they have a question. So we're identifying the problem. I'm unhappy at work. I think it's because I'm an emergency room physician and the imaging department, which I use all the time, is disrespecting me. I'm going to test the hypotheses that they are treating me differently. I'm going to analyze the data once I have it and look at what's happening with my patients when I send them to the imaging department versus what happens to other physician patients that are being sent to the imaging department. And then I'm going to communicate what I discover. So you can use the scientific method to really solidify what the issues are once you've done the what is true, what is more true, what is false, and say it out loud. Then you go, because there are a lot of you that not only are highly feeling, creative, caring people, but you're clinicians, you're scientists, you've learned through the scientific method. And so sometimes having those facts is hugely helpful. What if, you know, the nursing department was making it impossible for you at work, and yet, you know, you kept feeling like you were just an aggressive, curt, without the right social graces, that it was the problem was you. And so you kept altering your behavior all the time based on external and internal feedback that was happening. And then finally you say, I don't think this is just me. So I need to find the truth. So you do the little initial truth finding exercise, and then you go even deeper. You identify the tangible problems. You form some hypotheses around those problems. You test the hypotheses, you analyze the data, and then you don't just keep it under your hat, you communicate it so that you start to feel like you have a way of dealing with the situation. So one of the things that often happens for us is, because we've had this trauma at work or at home or both, we can't always tell whether this is just a normal part of processing and problem solving or whether we're triggered. And so I would like to suggest that if the issue is just something that needs to be processed and worked through, then you should be able to reflect, feel, and express, and you resolve the situation. So for instance, if you're having an issue with a patient and you're saying to yourself, I'm not sure if this patient is triggering me or whether I just need a healthy process with this person to problem solve why they always seem to be late. And so then, what that means is reflecting on, is it really true that they're always late, or do they remind me of my dad? No, I think it's pretty true that they're always late. How do I feel about that? I feel disrespected. I feel anxious. I feel angry. I feel confused. So writing down all your feelings, or at least identifying them in your head, and then expressing it by having a conversation with the patient where you say, I'd like to process with you an issue we're having around you not showing up to your appointments with me on time. I was feeling like this was an issue, but I wasn't sure. So I wanted to make sure that it really was an issue. So I went back and looked at our history together, and I see that out of the 10 times I've seen you, 8 of the times you were late. And it creates a lot of anxiety for me, because when you're late, then I feel like I want to have you leave feeling like it was a helpful, productive appointment. But if we're limited in time, then I feel rushed. I have a hard time focusing because I'm looking at the clock and realizing another patient is waiting. And so I just wanted to express this to you and ask you, what is it we might do? Do we need to, schedule the appointments 15 minutes, half an hour before you're supposed to be here, so you're for sure on time, and then you can just wait if you get here a little early? What needs to happen? And that's an example of just an issue, a problem that you can process through and problem solve. If, on the other hand, you have this patient that really does remind you of your dad and really does trigger you, then the difference with that is when you try to reflect, feel, and express, when you're in the reflection process, you start to get flooded. It's not a matter of, well, let me go back and see when they were here. You're like, oh my God, I don't think I want to see this person again. Oh, I hate the way that, they're constantly clearing their throat. I feel very jumpy. Oh my God, this is, so you start to really feel like you're being flooded by strong emotions, and that reflecting, feeling, and expressing isn't going to work. That what needs to happen is you need to pause. I didn't put pause here, but that's always what needs to happen when you're in the activated PTSD state, even if it's just a mild triggering event. So pause, and then validate your feelings to yourself. You know what? This patient really triggers you. He is so much like your dad. It's really hard. It's going to be okay. We're going to find a solution. That's the validating feelings and the starting to self-soothe, where you comfort yourself with, you can fire this patient, or you can, have a conversation with somebody else present where, you just can sort of agree that this isn't working out for either of you, and it's going to be okay. And so you comfort yourself, you validate your feelings, you disengage from the flooding. You say, okay, so now I need to move. You can look back at some of our previous PTSD presentations where we talk about when you're really in a triggered state, how you pause, how you begin to move and, physically move, because that really helps within the body. And then you redirect yourself. So when it's a triggering event like what I'm talking about, where you're not clear whether this is just something that needs problem solving and processing, or whether you're really being triggered, the processing won't work with the issue. Instead, you'll start to feel flooded by emotions, by thoughts and feelings about this patient or whoever we're dealing with. You want to pause, validate your feelings, find a way to self-soothe, move, disengage from the situation, so give yourself a break, and redirect yourself so that you can get to a more, grounded, embodied state from which to problem solve. And then finally, whether you're processing a problem or whether you're working through a triggering event, it's really important that you track your success. For people who are so highly ambitious, you often don't pause long enough to give yourself credit. You're on to the next problem. Okay, solve that problem, on to the next. That's a part of your training, right? So it's really important to track your success by summarizing, at least internally, what you've done. Like, wow, that patient really triggered me. I was honest with myself. I was kind and comforted myself. I disengaged, I redirected myself, and then I came back to it when I was stronger and had a plan in place. I did that really well. And if it's about the processing, problem solving, summarize what you did inside yourself, validate yourself for it, do the happy dance, celebrate, call somebody and say, guess what I did? And then move forward, because that's what builds momentum so that you begin to feel as if you're prepared, whether this is a problem to solve, whether this is a triggering event, you've got it. Then finally, I always share this slide with every presentation. Post-traumatic stress is real. It starts usually with flashbacks, which are either memories, thoughts, intrusive thoughts, or flooding of emotion. Our very first tendency is to want to avoid this. It almost always ends up with some type of arousal reactivity within ourselves. And sometimes that arousal and reactivity is isolating and withdrawing. Sometimes it's aggressing. Sometimes it's highly anxious behaviors. It affects our cognition. We can have short-term memory issues. We can feel depressed. We can struggle with, social interactions. And then finally, it affects our mood, and it can create, as I said, anxiety, strong fears, phobias, sadness, depression. So now it's time to share.